The following information for the continuation of this story comes from the newspapers of the time in 1831. The first mention of the murders was on the 10th of September 1831 on page 6 of the Tasmanian. It read, "A dreadful event. It is with the most unfeigned regret that we have to announce that Captain Bartholomew Boyle Thomas, brother of our respected colonial treasurer, has been murdered by the natives. While there was the slightest hope that this was possible, the intelligence received in town of this dreadful event might be unfounded, we hesitated to give utterance. We fear it is impossible to indulge even the shadow of such. It is too fatally confirmed by the arrival this morning of a gentleman from Launceston that Captain Thomas, Mr. Parker his overseer, and 3 of his men had been killed by the natives at his estate on the northern coast of the island, a few miles west of Port Sorell. We believe that Mr. Moriarty was the nearest neighbour to this ill-fated gentleman, at a distance of at least 30 miles. The beauty of the place, its numerous natural advantages, and Captain Thomas's anxiety to retrieve, even in the dismal solitude of the inmost recesses of the island, the very great losses, pecuniary and as respected the expectation he had right to entertain as the original managing partner of Colonel Gibbs, Messrs. Latour, Elphingston and Keats Association, commonly known here as the Horse Company, induced him to fix his abode in so an exposed situation. We are not acquainted with the circumstances of this deeply afflicting event, but shall not fail to flourish our readers with them in our next. Captain Thomas was a brave and accomplished cavalry officer. He served for several years with high reputation in the 9th Dragoons, with which regiment he performed the South American campaign. His next eldest brother is Colonel Thomas of the 20th Foot, commanding a large and important district in India. He was highly connected in Ireland, being nearly related to several noble families, to the O'Connor family and to Sir Henry Parnell, the new Secretary at War, by all of whom this deplorable event will occasion the deepest regret." The next article is from the Launceston Advertiser, Monday the 12th of September 1831. Captain Thomas, the lamentable mystery which hangs over the fate of this gentleman is still impenetrable. It seems that endeavouring to carry into effect the conciliatory measures which the government have in view towards the Aborigines, Captain Thomas and Mr. Parker his overseer went in pursuit of a tribe which appeared in the vicinity of Port Sorell, very inefficiently armed. Having some civilised blacks in company, they took up with savages, some of whom were secured by the black pursuers, and taken by them to Port Sorell. Captain Thomas and Mr. Parker were thus separated from their party, and have not since been heard of. From the story of the blacks, no certain intelligence of their fate can be obtained, but it is much to be feared that these gentlemen have fallen victims to the atrocity of the savages and their own humanity. Several parties have been sent to search for the bodies, but up to that moment of our going to press, no satisfactory news had arrived. It is reported this morning that the neckerchief of the unfortunate captain has been found by one of the parties, on search near a fire recently left by the natives, and that a woman in custody at Georgetown states that previous to the murder being accomplished, Captain Thomas was deprived of the means of defence by the natives snatching away his gun. We then move on to the inquest. There's lots of pages of inquest, but I'm only going to read certain bits of it. Thomas Carter here sworn. I am assigned servant in the employ of the late Captain Thomas. On Tuesday fortnight, the 30th of August, Captain Thomas went down with us in a boat to Port Sorell. Captain Thomas went to the North Down Beach, his own house, and left me and 3 other men with the boat. The morning after we arrived at Port Sorell, I was standing by the tent, eating some damper, about 10 or 11 o'clock, as near as I can judge by the sun, when I saw 2 natives coming along the bank. Immediately they saw me and held up their hands and sang out, "Breadly, breadly." I called to them and cut them some bread. which I gave them, and taking them into the hut, also gave them some tea. They appeared quite friendly. In about half an hour after this, Captain Thomas came riding down to the boat and asked me whether I'd seen any of the natives. I said I had got 2 of them in the tent. Captain Thomas got off his horse, and in about 5 minutes after, Mr. Parker came riding down to the boat. The captain went into the tent and asked the natives whether there were any more natives nearby. They both held up their hands, extending their fingers, and said, "Good many more, good many more." The captain then asked if they would show them where the others were, and they signified they would. On this, Captain Thomas was for going with them by himself, but Mr. Parker tried to persuade him not, and said he would go with him. They went into the bush together, Captain Thomas, the 2 blacks, and Mr. Parker, who had his gun under his arm. Neither my master nor Mr. Parker ever returned. In about 2 hours they had gone away. The black men came back with 3 others, 1 man and 2 women. Shortly after my master went away, the cart came down for the things. Then the blacks came back. A man named McCoy went up to them and shook hands with them all. We gave them some flour and some tobacco, and in a few minutes another woman came up with the cart. Having cooeyed several times for the master and Mr. Parker, we thought they had lost themselves in the bush, and started off home with the cart. Enticing the blacks with us, about 300 or 400 yards further on, another black man came up, and we also enticed him on with us, giving him flour and tobacco, as we had done with the others. We never asked about Captain Thomas and Mr. Parker till we got home. 6 of the natives followed us to the North Down beach, but the last one who came went away about 1/4 of a mile before we reached home. When we got to the house, we asked the blacks what they had done with the 2 white men. They said they had tabbled, which was run away. No search was made for Captain Thomas that night. The next morning, Mrs. Parker, wife of the overseer, sent a party of men to look after them. The party was away 2 days and a night, and returned without having heard anything of them. By a juror, we led the horses that Captain Thomas and Mr. Parker left behind the cart, and left the boat at Port Sorell. John Smith sworn. I am Colonial Assistant Surgeon, residing at Georgetown. On Tuesday, the 8th of September, on return of Mr. Freestone, the Chief Constable of Georgetown, from Port Sorell, where he had been in search of the bodies of Captain Bartholomew Boyle Thomas and Mr. James Parker, his overseer, who were missing and it was supposed had been murdered by the blacks. I was requested to go to North Down Beach to see Mrs. Parker, who was very ill. I left Georgetown on Friday morning, accompanied by Mr. Dunbar of the 57th Regiment, and arrived at Port Sorell about 2 o'clock. I met Jocelyn Thomas Jr. and Captain Moriarty on the beach, and they told me they had not succeeded in finding the bodies of Captain Thomas and Mr. Parker, and that they were waiting for a man named Mackay and a native woman from Westbury. We waited for some time and then went to North Down Beach. The next morning, Mackay and the woman arrived, and we all went to Port Sorell to look for the bodies, but without success. We returned to North Down Beach with the exception of the woman and Mackay, who were sent to Georgetown by water to fetch another native woman who was there. I waited at Port Sorell until Monday, and hearing a shot fired on the other side of the river, sent the boat over, which brought back Constable Warren, Mackay and 2 native women. When they came over, Mackay told me that the woman had told him where the bodies were. I said that he and the constable had better go with the woman first to find the bodies, lest the natives should be frightened if too many went together. They were accordingly and returned in about half an hour, when Constable Warren told me he had seen the bodies. I then went with these 4 and another man named Jones to look at them. We proceeded about 1.25 miles to the direction of the North Down Beach, but to the left of the road, to a spot about 4 miles from North Down Beach, the 2 native women went straight to a body, which I immediately recognised to be the remains of the unfortunate Mr. Parker. He was lying on his back. He had no hat or coat on. I caused the constable to open his shirt, and I examined the body. In the breast were 5 or 6 spear wounds, one on the left side within 2 inches of the heart, which had penetrated the chest. I am of the opinion that any of these wounds would have been would have caused death. They had all perforated the chest. I then had the body turned over, and upon examination found 6 spear wounds in the back and an extensive fracture on the right side of the head, apparently inflicted by the violent blow with a stick. The black woman then went about 50 or 60 yards to the westward, where I found another body, which I recognised to be that of Captain Thomas. I caused the men to strip off his shirt and examine the nature of the wounds, which were 1 wound on the left side of the chest, very near the heart, 3 others on the right side, one of which appeared to have bled profusely, as the shirt was soaked with blood on that side. There was also another spear wound higher up the breast, under the clavicle. Having had the body turned over, I discovered a spear wound in the back, which had penetrated the chest. The upper part of the neck and throat was eaten away by vermin. A party of soldiers and a constable sent by Captain Smith from Westbury in search of the bodies joined us, shortly after I left Port Sorell. They were with me when I examined the bodies, and by my directions assisted to cover them up with the boughs for that night, as it was too late then to remove them. Having dispatched some men to Northdown Beach to order 2 coffins to be made, and give directions for the bodies to be put in them when finished and brought down to me at Port Sorell the next morning, I returned to Port Sorell, where I had a tent. The bodies came down the following morning, and I had them put into the boat and taken to Georgetown. I consulted with Mr. Clark, and we determined to send them to Launceston, which was done. I was with the jury when they examined 2 bodies this morning. They are the bodies I have spoken of. Last article is from the Launceston Advertiser on Monday the 19th of September 1831. The particulars of this most appalling affair are now ascertained. We will here give a brief outline in order to introduce some facts not stated in the evidence adduced before the coroner. On the 30th of August, Captain Thomas left this town with a boatload of goods for his farm at Northdown Beach, about 5.5 miles from Port Sorell Creek. The following day he reached Port Sorell, and as it was blowing too fresh to admit of his landing at his jetty, thought it advisable to land at Port Sorell, and send a cart down to the beach for the things. Accordingly, he landed and proceeded home overland, leaving 4 men with the boat. The following morning, Captain Thomas left his farm with Mr. Parker on horseback for the purpose of loading the cart with the goods from the boat, and having on the way seen 2 or 3 natives. The captain's first inquiry on coming up to the men who had charge of the boat was if they had seen the natives. One of the men replied in the affirmative, that they had 2 in the tent, who had just come up just before, asking for bread. Captain Thomas learnt from the 2 sable visitants that there were many more blacks at hand, and inquired if they would lead him where they were. To this it appears they assented, and the captain was about to accompany them alone and unarmed when Mr. Parker said he would accompany him. He dismounted, and taking his gun under his arm, followed Captain Thomas and the 2 blacks into the bush. This was the last time these gentlemen were seen alive by any white person. For the remaining part of the story, we are obliged to trust a native woman whose story is interpreted by a black woman who has been some months at Georgetown. From her statement, so far as we can at present collect, we learn that the 2 unfortunate gentlemen were led up to the tribe about 2 miles from the beach by the blacks. Some natives from the mob joined them, and from what we can understand, were returning towards the beach with them. Whilst thus secure in their own minds from the apparent cordiality of the natives, a man stepped behind Mr. Parker and, snatching the gun from under his arm, ran off, when another instantly speared him in the back. Poor Captain Thomas immediately ran, but a spear having wounded him in the back, he was soon overtaken by the natives and knocked down. She states that she tried to save the white men, but could not. However, much doubt must still hang over this part of her story, as from the cunning afterwards displayed, there is a degree of finesse exhibited through her savage character. To return to the boat. The men whom Captain Thomas had left with the boat had finished loading the cart. Neither their master or Mr. Parker had returned, and they concluded that they must have got astray in the bush. They cooeyed, but received no answer. They then very coolly proceeded homewards, leaving their master and Mr. Parker, as they supposed, lost in the bush, unarmed and among the natives. without making the least search or inquiry respecting them, exhibiting the most heartless and reprehensible neglect and indifference as to the fate of their lamented master. Soon after they left the boat, they were joined by the 2 black men who had accompanied Captain Thomas, who brought 3 other natives with them, 1 man and 2 women. One of these women it was who led the constable to the spot where the bodies were found and who related the particulars of the tragedy just recited. On their return, the men enticed them to proceed with the cart towards its destination by giving them flour and tobacco. Still, the men with the cart made no inquiry about their master, whether from fear or from other motives does not appear. Another black woman soon joined them, and subsequently another man, making 7 in number, who, with the exception of one who ran into the bush about a quarter of a mile before they reached Captain Thomas's house, remained with the cart. When they reached home and had secured the blacks, some inquiry was made, for the first time, what was become of the 2 white men. When the natives answered they, the white men, had tabooed, ran away. The next morning, a party was sent in search, and the captured black was sent to Georgetown, and from thence the report of the then supposed murder reached Launceston on Monday the 5th of September. Ever since that time, parties have been kept in search of the bodies, but without success, until Monday last, the 12th, when by the assistance of the black woman before alluded to, who offered to conduct the constables to the bodies. Warren and Mackay, the latter one of Mr. Robinson's party, found the mangled corpses of these victims to a mistaken faith in the sincerity of these bloodthirsty savages. The bodies were brought in shells to Launceston on Wednesday night, and the coroner, William Littleton, Esquire, immediately summoned a jury to hold an inquest on the following morning.